Okay, so there's 5 male categories that are hyper attractive on the pornographic front to women: vampires, werewolves, pirates, surgeons, and billionaires. Hey, that's right, man. So, I can't help this. This is just how it is. And so
if you were a billionaire pirate with a medical degree, you could fucking kill it out there.
You'd be like, well, you'd be slaying it. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. My name is Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined by 2 guys who have somehow both found love despite not being billionaire pirate MDs, our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World.
I am a werewolf, by the way. Just want to get that out there.
I can see that.
Just when you were making all of the non-werewolf guys feel good about themselves, you gotta throw that in there, and yeah.
Well, shit. Oh, well. In any case, though, today we're going to have Matt McManus on for the deep dive we teased a few weeks ago on his new book, The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity, which, I'm really looking forward to that conversation and getting to share a lot of what he talks about there with you guys. It's basically a really accessible, really fascinating tour through the history of right-wing thought by a very smart, and I would also say freakishly well-read young socialist. But I want to hit a couple of other things first. The first is that our good friend and comrade Jason Miles of This Is Revolution podcast is making a feature-length documentary, and he's fundraising to finish it. We've got the link in the description for this episode down there below the box where you can see all of our faces right now. Down there. So I believe we have a video clip where he talks about it.
Hello, my name is Jason Miles, host of This Is Revolution podcast. I'm coming here today to ask you guys for some help. We're trying to complete this video essay project that I've been working on for the better part of a year called Kayfabe. And what we want to do with this project is a little different. We don't want to just complete it and put it up on a platform for you guys to see at your leisure. We actually want to have it a little more interactive. Upon its completion, we're going to take it all over the place, screen it with you guys, and of course have post-screening Q&As. Now, there are going to be some funding perks. There's of course going to be digital download. You'll be able to get it before anybody else. There's going to be some special edition autographed movie posters. And we're going to be putting together a little mini book made from the script. There's only one way this can happen, and that is with your help. And if you do not have the means to help, and trust me, I understand, can you share it with your people and tell them how cool of a project this is? How we digest media in this modern moment, juxtaposing it to pro wrestling. It's entertaining. It's funny. It's very engaging. If you want to see a trailer for it, it's embedded in this link here at Indiegogo. Thank you for your time, and I am out.
All right. I really want to see that full movie. Everything I've seen looks fantastic. Also really looking forward to going around and, doing some of those, hosting some of those screenings with Jason. I think we could do something really cool here in LA, but, also on the East Coast. And I really want to make that happen. So if you can, please do chip into to that. But next thing I want to do before we get to Matt is talk about a couple of things I've written for Jacobin. One of these actually was out technically before last week's show, but we just didn't get to it. And the first of these is the more recent. It's about the Pentagon budget. Right now, Congress is finalizing this year's National Defense Appropriation Act. And they're battling House and Senate versions. And, well, let's do a quick quiz. If you guys had to guess, how much do you think we're going to be spending in total on the U.S. military in the new budget?
I'm going by Price is Right rules, so I'm going to say $1.
All right.
That's okay. That's a pretty good guess. I guess maybe as much as $1 billion.
Oh, wow. You think $1 billion? I mean, if you think about this, the United States is surrounded to the north and south by extremely close U.S. allies, to the east and west by vast oceans. There's really very little, realistic scenario where it would be militarily attacked by anybody. I mean, there's terrorism, of course, but, like an army or a navy can't do much to prevent that. So, I mean, $1 billion sounds like a lot. But would you believe that you guys are actually both lowballing this?
I'm pretty sure I was.
Added together the regular Pentagon budget with the special appropriations for the war in Ukraine, with the money the Department of Energy spends on our potentially civilization destroying nuke stockpile, we are up to a grand total this year of a little over $900 billion.
Wow,
So
I won.
Price, yeah, Price is Right rules.
I
Jake
still
wins.
won.
yeah, Jake still won. But, in a country that doesn't even give its citizens socialized health care, and where millions of parents struggle to afford childcare and can't afford it at all, a lot of times they need it. And there are hundreds of thousands of human beings tonight who are going to be sleeping in shelters, on benches, in encampments, in public parks, even though, as we just said, the need for a defense budget, which they still charmingly call it, is seemingly extremely low. I mean, what's the scenario in which defense would kick in at all? Especially because the United States already, before it's a few tens of billions extra in this new budget, but even before that, the U.S. was already spending more than the combined military budgets of the next 10 top spending nations in the world combined. So I wish I could tell you that the Pentagon budget fight was about congressmen and senators objecting to the core absurdity of a $900 billion military budget when so many people's material needs are unmet, but it's not. The reason almost all the Democrats in the House voted no on the House version, the reason the Senate version is so different, and the fight's not over yet since the two versions somehow need to be reconciled, has absolutely nothing to do with that, because both parties, or at least their dominant wings, are more or less fine with that. Both of them want the U.S. military to continue to be the imperial global police force, even while we don't meet basic needs of many people in the United States. What they're fighting about are a bunch of right-wing culture war amendments to the House version about things like pride flags and drag shows at military bases, and travel expenses for service members who go to other states to have abortions, and banning the teaching of critical race theory in military academies, which I'm sure was a huge problem before this. And in the article, I got into all that. But I also got into a sort of bigger perspective about how to think, about culture war from a left perspective. And I basically tried to lay out a lot of what I was trying to articulate at one point in that, big struggle session we had a few weeks ago. So I think we have graphics from this part of the article. So what I say in the article is policies implemented so the politicians who pass them can score culture war points often have very real material consequences for their victims. What defines the culture war as a whole, though, is that for most of its combatants, the battle lines are drawn not over material interests, but cultural sensibilities. All the issues listed above, all that stuff I just said, will tend to divide people in ways that run through economic classes rather than tending to pit one class against another. And then it goes on, we should have a None of that means that the left can or should avoid taking positions on important social policy issues. But it does mean that on a strategic level, if we're going to defeat the right wing and be in a position to implement better policies on every issue, our job is to find ways to change the channel every chance we get to issues with the potential to rally the support of working class people in general based on shared material interests. And then the argument I go on to make from there is that both conservatives and sort of neoliberal centrists of the kind that dominate the Democratic Party have the opposite strategic interest. Both of them would rather people didn't fight about core material issues on which they have very little to offer. So both of them are just as happy to argue about drag shows on army bases until the end of time. And I'm not sure what else to say about this. I'm incredibly disgusted by the whole thing, but I don't want to let this topic end without giving a big shout out to the guy who, as imperfect as I will admit some of his voting record on related issues, I would still regard as the most useful politician in the United States by many, many miles, which would, of course, be the senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, who wrote an op-ed in The Guardian last week explaining why he was going to vote no on the Senate version. You can see it there. It says the Pentagon doesn't need another $886 billion. He's not, including, so I think maybe the 886, might have messed this up in the article. I think maybe the 886 does include the Department of Energy spending on nukes, but it doesn't include the Ukraine appropriation. When you add it all together, it's over $900 billion. So he says, I oppose this bloated defense budget. And in that op-ed, he says that he's going to vote no on the Senate version, even though it wasn't loaded down with all of the performatively obnoxious and in some cases cruel conservative culture war crap, because he actually cares about the core absurdity of pouring $900 billion into the Sarlacc pit of the Pentagon budget while we don't even give people health care. Okay. With that, I do want to move on to the other article. This is also going to ultimately be about politics. We're going to start with a little smidgen of philosophy. Guys, second quiz question. What's an atheist's worst nightmare? You're muted, Andy.
Oh,
All right, Andy,
thank you. It's when you're trying to put the baby in the pot to cook it and the baby won't fit. That's the atheist's worst nightmare.
Good answer.
That's a good one. That was my second choice. I was thinking that some leftist academic writes a book about you after you die about what you got wrong and what you got right and why it still matters.
I like that one. But I'm afraid to say that is wrong, and I'm actually a little embarrassed for both of you because one of our greatest thinkers, Kirk Cameron, actually settled this question several years ago, and I think we even have the clip.
Oh yeah, I definitely got it somewhere.
Hold this, Kirk. Behold the atheist's nightmare. Now, if you study a well-made banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 ridges. On the close side, 2 ridges. If you get your hand ready to grip a banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 grooves, on the close side 2 grooves. The banana and the hand are perfectly made one for the other. You'll find the maker of the banana, Almighty God, has made it with a non-slip surface. It has outward indicators of inward contents: green, too early; yellow, just right; black, too late. Now, if you go to the top of the banana, you'll find, as with the soda can makers, they placed a tab at the top. So God has placed a tab at the top. When you pull the tab, the contents don't squirt in your face. You'll find the wrapper, which is biodegradable, has perforations. Notice how gracefully it sits over the human hand. Notice it has a point at the top for ease of entry. It's just the right shape for the human mouth. It's chewy, easy to digest, and it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier. Seriously, Kurt, the whole of creation testifies to the genius of God's creative hand.
I mean, one thing that I really irks me about the whole thing is how you actually do eat a banana. Like there's this big debate online that you pinch it from the bottom and it just opens up real nicely. You don't have to cut it or anything.
Well, I was actually very unaware of the existence of this debate when we were talking about this on Slack beforehand. You gave me a bunch of links about different articles that came out at the time about the great how to eat a banana debate. But it is actually true that bananas are an extremely user-friendly fruit, very easy to open up, very sweet to eat. It is also true that this is a product of design, although in this case, as many people pointed out after, Kirk Cameron is the audience, Ray Comfort is the one who's actually speaking. After that video came out, that is actually human design and many generations of human genetic engineering to make that happen. But whether or not bananas are an atheist's worst nightmare, they're certainly a socialist's worst nightmare. So I believe we have a clip for this also from the East Germany one. Should be about 13 seconds long.
So Sabrina, where do you come from?
I am from East Germany. Yeah, we never had bananas. So
You never had bananas in East Germany? Why not?
it was not available.
Yeah, this is a standard example that people often went to during the Cold War when they were talking about the inadequacy of the selection at grocery stores on the communist side of the Iron Curtain, the abject failure of that system to meet the consumer needs of ordinary people. And since East Berlin was the westmost point of the Eastern Bloc, and there was West Berlin there with regular capitalist grocery stores, that was a point of contrast between the two systems that was often used in, there's a whole genre of East German jokes that a lot of them are about bananas, like how to use a banana as a compass. You put it on top of the Berlin Wall, the part that gets a bite taken out of points east. And, the kind of top-down economic planning they had in countries like East Germany was great for rapid industrialization, for churning out tractor after tractor and tank after tank, and thank God for it, or there might not have been in East Germany since the Nazis might not have been defeated in 1945 by the Soviet Union, but it was very bad at meeting fine-grained consumer needs. The phrase that Bhaskar Sankara uses in his book, The Socialist Manifesto, is that that system, that kind of planning, was all thumbs and no fingers. Now, some of us think a better form of socialism than the politically authoritarian and economically dysfunctional one that existed east of the Berlin Wall is possible, that humanity has more choices than recreating East Germany or just accepting capitalism forever. But oddly enough, the idea that socialism means that you can't even have a fucking banana has resurfaced in 2023. And this time, the call is coming from inside the left. This all started with this guy, Malcolm Harris, who I believe in his tweets, he was actually subtweeting friend of show, genuine friend of show, Matt Huber, something that Matt had said about socialism and growth before. So here, I don't know if we actually got, yep, here we go. So Harris says, this is his first tweet, pro-growth lefties accuse their opponents of being out of touch with working class preferences and focused on consumption instead of production. But what do they imagine planning support looks like for, say, fresh bananas at every American 7-Eleven among the world's banana workers? Next tweet. I think we better get planting those pawpaw trees. We're going to come back to that point about the pawpaw trees. Next tweet. That means fewer bananas for American workers, but if we're focused on production, not consumption, then the expropriation and suppression of Chiquita Corporation is obviously a huge win for the global working class as well as the environment. And then we've got one more. There need not be any moralism here. When you eat a banana, you're bad. Okay, that's good. Glad to hear that you're not bad for eating a banana. there just won't be any bananas because it doesn't make any other than capitalist sense to create a world-spanning daily banana infrastructure for people in Columbus, Ohio. And this thread, as funny as it sounds to say it, and as much as, I can sort of, look, as much as it's incredibly presumptuous to assume what anybody who's no longer with us would have thought about anything, in this case, it cuts against me because I just keep imagining a text from Michael Brooks where he's like mad that I'm doing this segment right now. It's like, why the fuck are you talking about bananas? But in any case, I think this sort of huge banana type of discourse that happened on socialist Twitter after this actually was interesting. I think there is actually some teachable stuff in there, because I think what this really exposed is this difference between a couple of different visions of what a post-capitalist future might look like. Is it the case that, for the sake of balancing everybody's needs and all this stuff, we need to actually scale back what we have under capitalism, or can we have generally shared abundance for everybody under a better system? So I wrote an article about this for Jacobin called "Socialists Really Do Have to Talk About Bananas." Say in the deck there, it's easy to mock the banana discourse that's materialized on left-wing Twitter in the last week, but there really are important issues here about how production and consumption would work under a feasible and desirable form of socialism. And what I tried to do there is to kind of think a little bit harder about and maybe share with readers who aren't familiar with this some of the work that's actually been done by socialist writers in the last couple generations about how exactly production and consumption could be coordinated in a better version of socialism. People like David Schweikart wrote a really good book called After Capitalism, or Alec Nove wrote a book called The Economics of Feasible Socialism. And then to start thinking about, okay, like, would we actually have bananas? And Eric Levitz, I should say, wrote a good article about this in New York Magazine called "Will There Be Bananas Under Socialism?" And there's a little bit of a quote in mine where he says, "It isn't so hard to imagine socialists taking power in Ecuador and nationalizing its banana industry. But there's no reason to believe Ecuador would stop exporting bananas in that hypothetical. Workers in the global South's export industries generally agitate for a higher share of the income generated by such sectors, not for their abolition. And banana exports are integral to the Ecuadorian economy, accounting for more than 4% of GDP, employing 250,000 people, and generating the foreign currency that it needs to pay its debts." Now, I guess if we're going to be scrupulously fair about it, maybe disregard that last point about foreign debt, because if we're imagining like truly global socialism, presumably Ecuador's debt would have been forgiven as part of this process. But I think a lot of the rest of those points still apply. And the best reason, there are a few not very good reasons. I'll get to it in a second, but the best reason to think that, okay, maybe you would want to like really dramatically scale back banana production is about labor conditions. Of course, labor conditions in every industry are terrible until the workers' movement comes on the scene. And in global South countries where you have often much weaker unions and much weaker regulatory state, et cetera, worse, but socialists don't generally assume those industries will cease to exist. We think that there can be better worker-run versions of them in the future. But the best reason in this case is some of the insecticides that are used to facilitate production at this mass scale, are potentially dangerous. And Eric, I think, says some plausible things about partial solutions to that in his article. But from my perspective, the main point is, okay, yeah, right now, but then agricultural technology doesn't just stand still. I mean, like right now under capitalism, it's progressing like crazy, right? Agricultural automation continues to pick up steam. And I'm very confused by the idea that we get this sort of really advanced global socialist society before agricultural automation picked up to the point where we could cut out the pesticides and, cut out human exposure, at least the pesticides, and continue to grow bananas at that scale. So when I wrote the article for Jacobin, I tweeted it out, and in the tweet, I think we have that, but anyway, if we don't, in the tweet, say something like, it's deeply misguided for socialists to buy into rhetoric about spoiled Americans needing to consume less, this is the part that bothered me most in a lot of the banana discourse, people being like, oh, you just want your treats. It's like, well, come on, man. Like, presumably we want working class people to have a better lifestyle in the future, right? We don't think, oh, these spoiled Americans, or, however you're supposed to pronounce it with the KKK Americans, like have too many damn treats and they need to, and they need to do without it. I mean, presumably we actually think that the living standard of working class Americans is not nearly what it should be. And certainly, fresh fruit doesn't seem like too much to ask for. There were a bunch of replies to this, which I don't know if we might not have actually. Yeah. So we want treats. We demand treats. We agree that it's a picture of a bunch of marching Nazis agreeing with my article. Crack Jacobin, right, with the KKK in the middle. That's my favorite, the crack Jacobin. So there's a lot of strong feelings about this, and a lot of sort of visceral dislike of this. This sort of idea that no, look, the sort of way the material abundance that has been provided by the machinery of global capitalism, we don't want to get rid of it, right? We want to more equitably and fairly distribute it. This is, and honestly, I do think there is a dimension of moralism, of a sort of like aesthetic revulsion at consumption that's driving a lot of this, that I think is really politically not at all helpful. I think the sort of superficially best point that, was made in some of these responses is that I didn't directly address the climate aspect of it in the article. I will point out that in those original tweets that started off all those weren't actually about climate. Those were about labor conditions. So I was responding to the argument that was made. But on climate, and then getting us back to the pawpaw tree, I did want to do a quick shout out to a segment that our friends David Griscom and Matt Wlash did on our brother podcast, Left Reckoning, on this topic. I think we have that clip.
Bananas are like one of like carbon footprint, incredibly minimal compared to like other products, right? Like palm oil and things like that. Carbon, like limited in the amount of carbon that they produce just in the general sense, right? There's wasteful production, things like that. But putting bananas on a shipping boat, they last a really long time. That's why it's a global foodstuff, because they last a long time and you can ship them from the areas that grow bananas so that they can get, to Ohio, where somebody who is, might need some nutrition can get it. And just I brought that up because he says there need not be any moralism here. When you eat a banana, you are bad. So that's good. Don't feel bad about having a banana, but because it doesn't make any other than capitalist sense to create a world-spanning daily banana infrastructure for people in Columbus, Ohio. So no bananas for people in Ohio, right?
Well, there's the platform.
It's absurd politics, but like the economics and the ecology behind it are also silly. He notes here that we should go, we better get planting those pawpaw trees, right? Do you know what that is, Matt?
No.
It's a big like fixation of like the environmental movement, and I've known about it for kids because I grew up around a lot of hippies, right? It's like this story of a fruit that was, that is indigenous to America, that has fallen out of mass consumption. Well, actually, mass consumption, it was very often eaten by like Native Americans and indigenous cultures. It grows in parts of the East Coast and through parts of the Midwest. It's supposed to be really good. I've never had one. They're hard to find, right? Because they never built up mass groves, right, to grow them and to distribute them. Do you know why, Matt? Shelf life is about 2 days, so it's not a very efficient form of food, which is why it's more something that, like, if you want to find it, you have to really search for it and maybe go to somebody who might have some growing near them, right? So it's not a reasonable thing. It's like, yeah, we're going to start growing papaw trees on a mass scale to have like 1-2 day shelf life food. Just going to, I mean, like, that's wasteful.
Yeah. So saw in the chat, JB said, how do you propose to manage global consumption of fossil fuels in feasible socialism? I think that we desperately, urgently need to transition away from fossil fuels. It's not that we need to use them less, right? It's that we need to transition yesterday to alternative forms of energy. And this is, I think, a point that it's easy to get mixed up about, but it's really important to be clear on, because I think this is where a lot of the debate goes awry, and people sort of miss each other's points, because when you say and God, I mean, I think about that specific, like the fact that Harris's example specifically fucking Ohio, which is like just a part of the country that has just been completely ravaged by late stage neoliberal capitalism. You think about, East Palestine and the derailment. You think about the, opioid epidemic. These are people who are, not doing well, and think, you know what? You know what I want to promise these people? You can't even have fucking fresh fruit in the grocery store. That's too much, you spoiled American. No treats for you. But when you say, okay, I want people to, I want us to have a vision of socialist abundance for people in Ecuador and Columbus, Ohio, all over the place. I think sometimes that gets misread as we should continue to produce in the way that we are right now. Of course, we can't do that ecologically. That's not possible. We have a climate crisis. We urgently need energy transition. But I think the point that people often miss in all this is that energy transition itself involves massive amounts of growth, right? It involves massive amounts of production. Like, if you say, and fair enough, hey, at least for, like people who live in places like Los Angeles, it is absolutely absurd that you need to drive everywhere. It's bad for the environment for everybody in the city to have a car. We need much, much more public transportation, right? And we need, lots more and better public transportation going many more places. What you're describing is a massive building project, in that like small example. And I think, when you talk about the stuff that's in like the Green New Deal, like let's change the power infrastructure for every single building in the country. You're talking about massive growth, right? Massive employment, massive new construction, which is a good thing, right? There's no way to do the global climate transition that we need to do just kind of by hippieishly doing less, right? You need to build stuff, and you need to like just logistically, for the sake of doing it, we're talking about massive growth, and then I hope continue to do so to better meet human needs in more sustainable ways, which, by the way, is also the only political program that's going to make this happen, right? I think a lot of liberals have this idea that the main obstacle to climate change action is people not like believing that it's happening. I think I think like a much bigger problem is people not believing that the things that are going to be done to solve it are going to be in their interests. That, it's going to be the entirely reasonable fear that's going to be done like kind of on the backs of the working class instead of in ways that benefit the working class, which again is why, as much as the phrase got poisoned and distorted, in right-wing propaganda, is why I actually thought the original Green New Deal framing was really good and really important. Okay, so the last, the way that the article ends is by making this larger Marxist point about all of this. No society has ever voluntarily retreated to a lower level of productivity. It's unrealistic to expect that to happen in the future. If socialism, in the sense of the extension of democracy to the economy, is as bad at delivering consumption as socialism in the sense of what existed in places like East Germany, it will never become the dominant mode of production in the first place, and we'll never have to worry about the state of bananas under it. Instead, our vision has to be abundance made truly universal. The whole point of Marx's materialist theory of history is that capitalism, for all its horrors, wasn't an avoidable moral mistake, but a necessary phase of historical development that built up the most advanced economic machine for producing material abundance in human history. Whatever happens with this or any other particular projects, and look, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen with global weather patterns and what that means for banana production. The more general point is that distributing that abundance more equitably is a vision that can gain mass traction. Rolling it back is not. It's it's going to be red plenty or red nothing. Those are the options, guys. Okay. It's time for Matt. Before we bring on Matt, I do want to just do a couple of quick housekeeping notes. One of them is that we have finally restarted our weekly series of Thursday night debate breakdowns. We did the first one of those back from our very long hiatus last Thursday with Dr. Eric Osgood. We looked at actual friend of show Emma Viglin's debate with Tim Poole. And I think the next, bunch of them are going to be like that one was, which is to say it's going to go long, and the second half of it is going to be in a post game for patrons. We're not going to put it out in the main podcast feed, but we'll also put audio versions of these. We never did that before on the Patreon for both the main show and the post games for the Thursday night debate breakdowns. So if you're not a patron yet, patreon.com/Ben Burgess. So you can get access to all of that good stuff. The second one in the series of reanimated debate breakdowns is going to be this Thursday. We're going to be watching Norm Finkelstein's classic debate with Alan Dershowitz. This is this is part of this whole story that ends with Dershowitz getting him fired. This is the kind of the Norm origin story, and we're going to have on for that discussion. We're going to have Matthew Vernon Whalen, who's the oral historian, who was the guy who transcribed that Sopranos conversation with Michael. This breakdown was his idea. We're also going to have our producer Jordan, who actually lived in Israel for 14 years. Israel is what Dershowitz and Finkelstein are debating. And we are also going to have Norm himself. Yeah, I don't think he's going to stay for the whole breakdown, but he's going to join us for a few minutes of sort of reflecting back on the experience at the beginning of the stream. So really looking forward to that. On the main show on Monday nights, next Monday, we are going to do a very full in-studio show with Jordan, with Jason Miles, and with the one and only Matt Cushbaum-Chrisman. Still figuring out all the topics for that, but that should be a lot of fun. That is going to be next Monday. For the post game tonight, we were going to have Katie Halper. She actually ended up having to reschedule. This might end up being crew only, but we've got some things for you. We have some treasures awaiting you in tonight's post game.
I kind of wish we didn't, but thanks to Andy, we do. So
Yeah,
we saw it. We saw it. So now,
yeah, we've already seen it. We can't unsee it. We're gonna make the patrons see it too for some reason. I don't know why we want to punish them for supporting the show, but you know, I guess that's the deal. So looking forward to that. Gonna bring on Matthew, the man McManus, and I will see you guys in the post game.
Hey guys. All right, Ben. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. You know, going to see the National next Monday, so I'm really excited about that. I've been spending an awful lot of time in Detroit, which is actually a really fun city. So, color me surprised, but there's an awful lot to do in Michigan during the summer.
Yeah, there is. It's you know, yeah, I love Detroit. There's, you know, it's the arsenal of democracy, beat the Nazis. There's Detroit Rock City. There's a whole song about that. You know, that's you know, Motown. You know, that's Detroit is Detroit is fantastic. Has the Red Wings.
I'm not sure that I'm really willing to endorse that, but everything else you said is a good thing, especially like the Motown Museum.
Fair enough. Detroit Institute of Art, you can see those amazing Diego Rivera murals. Yeah, big stamp of endorsement on the city of Detroit here. Ann Arbor, not so much, but I'll forgive it. So
I was hanging out in Ypsilanti last week, and I think I fucking sent you the picture. I was like, "Can I just get like a sampler of like some of the stuff that you have?" And they're like, "Sure." And it was $10, and it was 4 like gigantic shots of whiskey. And I was like, "How much is this?" Like $10.
It's like what they were calling the sampler. Like each of those glasses of whiskey would be like a pretty generous pour if you just ordered it.
Yeah, that was it. I was like, well, tomorrow's gonna be a fucking interesting day. Because I mean, Marian's like, "Are you gonna drink it all?" I'm like, for $10, it would almost feel criminal not to, right? They're just so damn generous. We had a great time though. Yeah, I mean, Ypsilanti is also a lot of fun. So
yeah, Andy points out in the private chat, RoboCop statue. So yeah, all kinds of good stuff there.
Up there with Eminem as the state's most suspicious citizen, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's Eminem. You know, we've maybe contributed other things to music. You know, I mean, Ypsilanti is where like Iggy Pop is from. So that's
Come on, I remember you describing Eminem, and these were your exact words as the poet laureate of your state. And hey, I like Eminem, so you know, all power to that, right?
I did say that. That is correct. That's the thing I said. Yeah, as long as it's not Kid Rock, I'm happy.
Oh yeah, definitely. Fuck that.
But you know, Sweet Home Alabama has horrifying politically reactionary lyrics, but it's at least good music. Kid Rock's little ode to sitting on the shores of Lake Michigan, drinking whiskey and listening to Sweet Home Alabama is both abysmal as music and you know, is implicitly an ode to the reactionary lyrics, and also makes me like my own memories of doing the stuff he's describing in that song less.
It's so funny we mentioned that. Like when that song came out, I'm like, man, I have never heard like a more vicious plagiarization take place within music. Basically, just like carbon copying that song right down to the riff. Then I started looking into it, and I was like, man, I remember listening to like Sweet Home Alabama when I was a kid. I'm like, oh, that sounds nice. And then I looked into the lyrics. I'm like, holy fuck, that's bad. Like, how did I never catch that before, right? I'm like, no, sorry, I'm all for Neil Young and that thing. There's no apologizing for the conspiracy.
It turns out the Southern man do need Neil Young to tell him what to do, and those lyrics prove it. Definitely one of the there you go, one of the better exports of the Michigan Northern Annex, or Canada as it's sometimes called.
Thank you. Yeah.
From
my good old province of Ontario, right? So
yeah, exactly. Well, I'm excited to get into this book. I mean, we kind of teased it a few weeks ago, but this is this is when we can really do it for real. Jake, do we have the graphic of the book? The political right and equality, turning back the tide of egalitarian modernity.
Should also say Andy contributed the cover art there. So in many ways, it's a co-production, since the cover art's what everyone seems to be talking about. So
yeah. No, I have that's I mean, at least 50% of the nice things that people said about my last book were about Andy's cover. So
well, somebody tweeted out to me, they're like, why did you put two unserious people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro on the cover of your book? I'm like, because you fucking remember it. That's what you're fucking tweeting at me right now, that this is what appears on my cover. So
yeah, exactly.
Andy is vindicated.
And the book, like the inside of the book, is not about people like that. It's about their more impressive forebears. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, what are you supposed to do? Put like Burke and DeMaistre on the cover? Like nobody knows what those guys look like.
Yeah. Or I could be really racy and put like Alexander Dugan on the cover and just get a whole bunch of people messaging me being like, so what's this all about, right? All kind of the worst people on the internet, the frogs and the people with the pictures of U-boats as the pictures being like, so is this really about us or for us? We're not really sure. So no.
Yeah. Well, I will say one of the things people aren't quite sure. Well, actually, let me just set it up this way. Let's say that the person who's watching this or listening to it later is a truly exemplary person who's read your previous books about the right, and they want to know what's different here. What are you doing in this book that's different from what you've done in your previous books?
Well, first off, if you have read my previous books on the right and you've then gone to this one, let me know if you're in town, because I at least owe you a beer, or for $10 you can get 4 shots of whiskey. Your choice, right? Beer, 10 or 4 shots. But the big difference is a lot of people were quite receptive to my postmodern conservatism thesis. Somewhat extensive, somewhat too much actually, since one of the people who really early on endorsed it was Nate Hockman, who was really interested in it. And then, as we all know, it seems like he might have taken some of what I said a little bit too on the nose about the kind of
he thought it was an instruction manual.
Yeah, well, that was what we all disagreed on. Like when he was sitting there, he's like, "This is an intriguing thesis." I was like, "Is it though?" I'm not endorsing this as a way of life. But one of the things that people criticized about the postmodern conservatism book was that it pathologized and symptomized the political right, saying, "Listen, there's a postmodern culture out there. It's engendered by neoliberal material relations." I won't rehash the whole book, right? And this is something that the left needs to confront in the following ways: X, Y, and Z. And then I kind of explained the features of postmodern conservatism. And the number one thing people came back to me at was whether or not this is true and what you're describing is a real thing. And I would assert after the QAnon shaman stormed the Capitol that I have been vindicated enough. I think that people can say postmodern conservatism is real. But whether or not it's real, it is real. You don't really take the right on its own terms, right? You're kind of looking at it from afar. And I thought about that. I'm like, you know what? They're absolutely right. It's not actually dealing with the arguments that conservatives put forward. So I'm going to write a book that is exclusively about that. And so the end result, after many years of work and reading an awful lot of crappy conservative books, but also some very interesting ones, is the text of Political Right and Equality.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the book really functions as, at least, even if it's not the primary intention, is like a really good crash course in what a bunch of conservative thinkers and in a couple of cases, thinkers who be anachronistic to call them conservatives, but were really influential on later conservatives. Mm-hmm. What they thought, how they saw the world, and you're certainly presenting a critique of it throughout the book. But I mean, it's also just like a really useful introduction to these guys. It's essentially a guided tour of right wing and influential on the right wing thought. Kind of from Aristotle to Alexander Dugan. And I want to, we're not going to hit everybody, obviously, in the time that we have right now. So we are going to be leaving stuff out. So, do go buy the book. The link is down there in the description. But I do want to talk about a bunch of them, ones who, as I was like going through this book to get ready for this conversation, I thought you had interesting things to say about. So asked Andy to just do silent movie style title cards for each of the guys we're going to hit on.
Cool.
So let's start with Aristotle.
Nice.
So as you say, he's not, he's obviously not a conservative. That would be wildly anachronistic, but this is a guy who non-coincidentally is massively influential on conservatism, once there actually was such a thing, right? So why don't you start us with that part of your book?
Sure. Well, I just want to foreground because some people got angry at me for this. I do not think that Aristotle is a conservative. And yes, I am deeply aware of the fact that many progressive liberals, Marxists, were deeply influenced by Aristotle. I'm deeply influenced by Aristotle. I think that there's a lot of interesting things in his account of virtue ethics and human capabilities that the left has to learn from. So what I'm criticizing is more, or analyzing, I should say, the Aristotelian worldview, as I call it. Which has been profoundly influential for many conservative figures. And the basis of the Aristotelian worldview is this notion that society consists of ordered ranks, where as a whole, we need to appreciate that everyone has a role there to fill within society, and each rank needs one another. But it's by no means the case that all the ranks within society have the same kind of dignity or status ascribed to them. And Aristotle is very explicit about this in the Politics, where he stresses things like, look, women possess a certain degree of deliberative reason, which means that they are not entitled to the same kind of political rights and privileges that men are. And slaves, or natural slaves, as he infamously called it, possess no deliberative reason whatsoever. So the only things that they're really fit for are manual labor. And then when it comes to citizens, actual citizens, there are various kinds of rank ordering that we can talk about within that as well. If you have a citizenry that is more virtuous and more intelligent, then maybe they can be ascribed more political power. If you have an aristocracy that is more virtuous and more intelligent, and a citizenry that's base, then that's what should be given power, et cetera, et cetera. And down through the centuries, this idea of conceiving of society as an organic whole consisting of differentiated ranks set by nature really evolves and transmutes in a lot of interesting ways, but remains pretty constant. I draw very heavily on the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's work, Modern Social Imaginaries, where he talks about the antiquarian view that is associated with Aristotle as one defined by a principle that he calls hierarchical complementarity. Right? Again, this idea that all parts of the hierarchy play a role, but they don't have the same kind of dignity and status ascribed to them. And for the most part, this Aristotelian worldview, broadly speaking, functions pretty well as a political ideology defending hierarchy or reifying hierarchy for about 2,000 years, give or take change. Right about up to the time where you start to see progressive movements and early proto-liberals and early materialists like Hobbes really begin to put profound pressure on it. And what happens when they begin to put pressure on it is a new worldview starts to be articulated, one that holds that actually people aren't naturally sorted into ranks within a society governed by hierarchical complementarity. In fact, in the state of nature, people are fundamentally equal and they have equal freedom. And society is, in fact, an artifact, not an organism. It's construed by human agency and it can be remade and reworked according to human agency.
Yeah. So I think one, so there are two things that stand out to me as interesting here. One is one of the, obviously the fundamental differences between what Aristotle thought and what all those guys you're talking about, would end up thinking, which is that the sort of idea of baseline moral equality, that, that everybody is kind of intrinsically deserving of the same package of rights, that you more or less start to get with the beginnings of, modern bourgeois liberalism, with notoriously some massive carve-outs.
Oh yeah,
you know,
huge carve-outs, giant carve-outs.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, okay, in a lot of cases, maybe the female half of the human race, not so much. In a lot of cases, I mean, God, John Stuart Mill, India, right? Is kind of a carve out,
It's about a quarter of the world, right? Yeah,
exactly. But in a very messy and incomplete way, right? You start to get that there. That's just not there in Aristotle. I mean, he thinks, sure, he doesn't rule out that there are people who become slaves who aren't natural slaves, but and in that case, maybe that's tragic, but he thinks that it's like a totally reasonable thought that there could be people who are just fitted by nature to be slaves. So that's obviously one really big important difference. But then the other thing that hits me is the commonality between like maybe some of what Aristotle says in the Politics that you have interesting things to say about in the book, and kind of the conservative wing of early bourgeois liberalism. So, so in particular, what I'm thinking of here is, something that's always driven me crazy about, mostly conservative, sometimes libertarians, some of your dimmer liberals will say stuff like this too, where they'll say, oh, the United States isn't a democracy, it's, never meant to be a democracy. We're, republic, which is semantically is the equivalent of saying, oh, you're not sitting on a chair, you're sitting on a piece of furniture. Like a, republic is a more generic, word than democracy. But I remember talking about this last year, and my friend Gareth pointing out that, well, there is a sort of charitable way of reading this, which is that, if you even look at some of the views of like many of the American founders, there's a range of views there, but a lot of them, they'll say things like, well, pure democracy isn't good. What you actually want is some sort of amalgam of elements of like democracy and aristocracy, and
mixed regime
and monarchy. And of course, the people, my critique of the people who say, oh, I want a republic, not democracy, is that they, kind of don't have the balls to say that out loud, that like, that's what they mean, right? Is that, no, they want elements of aristocracy and monarchy. But like that sort of conception that like something like that is probably the better state is like super Aristotelian.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, again, there are different ways to read Aristotle and different ways people have read Aristotle, right? So again, Martha Nussbaum's Aristotle is much more egalitarian, much more friendly to democracy than somebody like John Finnis's Aristotle, who I kind of used as a template for the Aristotelian worldview that conservatives like. But one thing that comes really through in the book, I hope, is the relationship of this idea of hierarchical complementarity to certain notions of Aristotelian teleology. And this is really important because what really comes through with the teleological idea set by Aristotle is this notion that, listen, you have a role to play that's not chosen by you. You can choose to deviate from the natural teleology that's ascribed to you. But if you do so, then you're only going to corrupt yourself and consequently corrupt the city. And so you're to fulfill the role that nature set for you, or if you're a Christian, God set for you, right? And this really maps quite successfully onto arguments for hierarchical complementarity as well, because whether or not that's what Aristotle himself meant, many Aristotelians down to the present day will say, listen, God intended you to be a peasant laboring in your fields. God intended the king to be the king. And it's not for you to sit there and try to challenge this natural order. And if you do so, you're upsetting the natural order of things. How many times have we heard that, right? Or if you want something more contemporaneous, as late as the 1980s, frankly, as late as the early 2000s, you would still see all kinds of conservatives like Justice Scalia or John Finnis saying things like homosexuality was a deviance from the teleology set by nature or by God, and it was corrupting both sex and the person who engaged in homosexual sex. So society should not tolerate it. And what you start to see with the emergence of this liberal worldview, as compromised as it is, like you said, is this notion that actually human beings are yet to determine the ends that they aspire to, what their telos is going to be. And Hobbes, in particular, as the first great materialist, is extremely expressive about this, where people say that we're mean to each other today. Just read, the last parts of the Leviathan, where Hobbes will say things like, there have been very few things that have been said in as much ignorance as Aristotle's entire philosophy. And then he just goes through it bit by bit by bit and says, just the whole thing is worthless. But the number one thing that he singles out is this idea of teleology, saying that, no, human beings choose what it is that they're going to aspire to, choose what it is that they think is good, and choose what they think is bad. I think sometimes it goes too far with this. But the implications are quite radical. And this has a profound relationship to his belief that the Leviathan or the state or civil society, whatever you want to call it, is an artificial construct established by free and equal persons. And the connotation, even if Hobbes doesn't go there, is, of course, that it can be remade if we so wish.
Yeah, so this, I think, brings us nicely to the next guy I want to talk about, who is firmly situated in the era that you're bringing us to, is later even, which is David Hume.
And
of course, nobody will be surprised that I want to talk about Hume. Anybody who remembers the cover art, this is pre J. Andrew World cover art, actually. On my first book, the one with the same name as this show, is this picture of Ben Shapiro starting to say facts don't care about your feelings and being hushed by David Hume, which is a joke about what's sometimes called Hume's guillotine, the cutting off facts from values. And one of the things I remember back in, 2018 or whatever, when we first released that cover, the book came out in like spring 2019, is people being like, "Oh, come on, bro, Hume was a Tory, right? He's a conservative," and there is, and that is true. It's true it's true in a really interestingly complicated way, though. Something you really bring out in the book is that on the look, I mean, somebody who's on one of the title cards, we're going to get to, Yoram Hazony, is sort of like, when I've talked to him, and one of the things we sort of bonded over is that we both really like David Hume, but in very different ways, right? And the sort of aspect of Hume that I like has a lot to do with all the stuff that makes him really intellectually useful to people who can't stand conservatism, right? So the way that that fact value guillotine sort of cuts off at the joints any attempt, kneecaps any attempt to derive conservative conclusions from the idea of teleology that's built into nature. Also, Hume is, if not exactly an atheist in the sense that we would understand now in the dialogues concerning natural religion, he seems willing to grant that something or other must have created the universe, and we don't really know a lot about it, but he at least thinks that there's no reason to particularly think that it would be like what we have in mind when we use the word God. He, writes essays where he's questioning even like the taboo against suicide, monogamy, so this is the kind of stuff that people who hated Hume at the time were hot and bothered about. But there is this whole other side of him that
I just want to say my favorite anecdote about Hume was apparently he got stuck in a bog at one point, and as a well-known atheist, a woman was walking by and said she would help him out of the bog if he professed a belief in God. He did. She helped him out, and he said it was the best argument for God's existence that he'd ever encountered, because he's like, listen, I needed help, and God sent someone to help me. So
fair enough. But at least the best argument for affirming it in that moment. So there is this other side of Hume that you get into, which is the side that Yoram is keying in on, which is the part of Hume that is, in fact, in many ways, very closely anticipating the next guy that I wanted to talk to you about. It was Edmund Burke. Tell me about Hume's conservatism.
Sure. Well, I want to say first off, I was thinking about you when I was writing that section, and I was like, no, I don't want to go too far with this because Ben will get angry at me for that. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of Hume's epistemology, his theory of the self, to a certain extent, even like his naturalization of ethics, and of course his writing style, which I just think is brilliant. Not only that, I think that Hume, if you'd want to go out for a drink with any philosopher,
Yes.
my number one would be Marx, but Hume would be pretty close up there. You know what I mean? He seems like he'd be a fun guy just to hang out with and shoot the shit with. But look, I think that Hume is one of the first examples, and this is what I no, don't have any advanced thoughts to offer on that. I think Hume is one of the most interesting examples of an early figure who really internalized many of the most radical strands of Enlightenment thinking, particularly with regard to epistemology, metaphysics, and theory of the self, and was not shy about advancing them in even more radical directions. But the skeptical conclusions that led him to in epistemology, metaphysics, theory of the self, actually led him to relatively conservative political conclusions. Now, that might seem contradictory, but actually it really testifies to the richness and breadth of his personality, even if I disagree with his own political conclusions. Because what you start to see with Hume's anti-foundationalism, as it's sometimes called, is this belief that, well, what we need to do then is to naturalize political institutions and ethical institutions and not examine them too scrupulously and demand that they conform to any kind of transcendent or transcendental pattern or expectations. Because they're never going to be able to do so. And if we demand that they do so, then that's only going to lead to chaos. So really, you're better with the devil that you know than the devil you don't. And as I make clear in the book, I think Hume himself was a little bit wary about this because at points in his minor essays, you'll sometimes see him endorse various kinds of social reform and say we can go a little bit further when it comes to things like freedom of speech, for example, or a little bit further when it comes to things like participation in politics. But we shouldn't go that far because if we cause social disruption, it's going to limit our sociability, and God only knows what kind of horrific consequences will come about in the long run. So if you want my personal evaluation of Hume, I think he's one of those people who was very comfortable with intellectual radicalism as long as it was cordoned off from the social realm. And personally, I'm just not of the same kind of viewpoint, right? Although I think Hume, as a broadly speaking amiable guy, probably just didn't want to stir the pot too much in those particular ways, even if he was willing to stir other ones.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that my take is exactly the same, but you are in really good company because that's almost exactly Bertrand Russell's take on him. He has a line in the History of Western Philosophy where he quotes Hume has this famous passage about how he gets himself to the point where like he's realized that he doesn't have a good argument for his stream of experiences corresponding to objective external reality or relations of cause and effect, and then he just goes and plays billiards with his friends until the sense of reality reasserts itself. And Russell's like, all right, well, I guess explains how he managed to be a Tory.
That's a good line, yeah.
But I think I actually think there's like a more sympathetic read on some of that stuff that I think he had sort of pretty reasonable ideas about what the kind of outer limits of human reasoning were in that kind of internalist sense of like internal in the sense that like it's kind of available to us, like we can like peek under the hood and see what we're doing when we make these inferences and all that stuff. And I think when it comes to certain very, very basic things like the external world and causation, I think he was maybe not an outright not actually so much a skeptic as a externalist. In other words, somebody who thinks that like what makes these reliable and for inferences isn't going to be internally available to us the same way that like a dog knows where this bowl of food is, but he wouldn't be able to explain how he knows it. But like there are other things where he seems to be making all these substantive arguments that assume that we do have pretty good idea of like how causation works and, you know, stuff like that. I mean, I think as applied to politics, you know, the kind of thing that, like, you know, Yoram's love of Hume really latches onto is this idea that, well, actually the empiricist thing is to err on the side of caution. And look, I obviously disagree. I'm, you know, I am in favor of, you know, radical social change. The vast majority of what I do with my life is about that. So, you know, I obviously don't like his conclusion, but I guess I have to give him that, like, out of all the reasons that you could have for that, that's probably the most respectable one. That in other words, like, it's not like, oh, God has ordained that things have to be this way. It's not, you know, I don't know. I could just tell that, like, you know, I'm one of the superior people who deserves to get all the good stuff. You know, the plebs don't, you know, deserve anything. It's well, I'm afraid that we start messing with it too much, we could get something even worse. And again, I mean, I don't think that's like a, you know, I mean, something I think you very correctly say in the book is that, like, if you actually read the passages where Hume lays some of this out, I mean, none of it really feels like it adds up to, you know, anything that you even get the sense that he necessarily thinks is a knockdown argument. It's, you know, but it's like the sort of consideration that it's like, you know what, I can respect that. I think you have to, and frankly, I think it's the kind of thing that if you're going to argue for radical social change, I think you have to reckon with, because most human beings, to some degree at least, have a reasonable fear of trading things that they might not love, but are familiar with things that, for all they know, could end up being even worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to like lean into Yoram's reading a little bit, since actually that's one of the things that inspired my take on Hume. I think that actually one of the ways that we can understand this is in terms of the pragmatist distinction between knowing how and knowing why, right? Hume would ultimately say, if you're asking why social institutions or social practices are the way they are, it's kind of the same kind of thing as asking, you know, why do you want to eat? There's a kind of series of questions that you can ask about that can be answered. And at bottom, you just have to say, it's just the way that it is. You know, you kind of end in brute naturalism. But knowing how is a little bit different, right? You know, you can know how to pass a bill in the British Parliament. You can know how to interact with France when you're trying to resolve a diplomatic crisis. You can know how to barter and trade in the streets of Edinburgh because you've been doing it in your entire life. And to a certain extent, Hume follows in a conservative tradition of saying we should err on the side of knowing how and doing what we know how to do. Because it's very possible that if we try to change what it is that we do, that things might be worse. And my response to that usually, which by the way is an iteration of Hirschman's Jeopardy thesis, is to say, listen, it is possible that if we change things, they might get worse. I think that progressives sometimes just valorize change for its own sake. But it's not only the case that things might be better if we change things rationally on the basis of sound evidence. It's even the case that the unintended consequences of what it is that we're doing, because that's something that conservatives also lean in on quite a bit, might be beneficent rather than just, you know, regressive. So you see people like Thomas Sowell, Hume, Hayek, Hazoni say, well, what if this happens and you don't intend it to occur? And I'll usually say, it's possible that bad things might happen. It's also possible that very good things might happen as an unintended consequence of what I plan to do. You know, I might be intending to ameliorate poverty. And as a knockdown consequence of that, even though I didn't intend it, crime rates will reduce. But very few people are going to complain about that. Right. So I guess you could say that temperamentally, I'm necessarily more optimistic. I guess I just have more Gramscian optimism of the will than Hume does when it comes to these kinds of questions.
Yeah. I like that point about positive unintended consequences. I'd also point out that keeping things the way they are also often comes with unintended consequences. I mean, you know,
that's for sure. I mean, if we keep on this track, like you said before the show,
climate change.
Yeah, then we're all going to die, right? So
exactly.
It might be worthwhile to actually take some action on that on the basis of the good scientific reasons we have to take action on it, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a more controversial example, but I mean, arguably the fact that the wave of socialist revolutions at the end of World War I was mostly beaten back and the original status quo was restored. It's like, yeah, well, that led to fascism. That's, like, because if you stop things from changing when they need to change, oftentimes that doesn't just mean that you only get things that have already happening. That will sometimes mean that worse things happen. Climate change is a really obvious example. Or like, yeah, I mean, aggressively pursuing nuclear disarmament would be a big change, but if we don't do it, then the unintended consequence of that could be that human civilization doesn't exist anymore, because of World War III. Okay, so I think a lot of we don't need to linger, I think, too long on him, because a lot of what we said about Hume, I think, kind of anticipated him, but I do think this like nickel tour would be very incomplete without Edmund Burke, who the title card said that should be a U, I believe, but whatever. It's all good. So yeah, talk to me about Burke.
Well, Burke is a very interesting thinker. Ted Hodrick had some very nasty things to say about him, but I stayed with Corey Robin and believing that he's right up there with Nietzsche, Hayek, and the other big uns, right, in terms of his influence and importance on the right. And one of the reasons I think he's extremely important is actually that he's quite different in many respects than David Hume. Because I actually break from the conventional reading of Burke as a kind of pragmatist or traditionalist. I actually think that there are some quite radical things that he has to say in his text that are innovative, right? That contribute something to the history of ideas, just not anything that I happen to agree with. So the way that I tend to conceive of Burkeanism, drawing very heavily on the theory of aesthetics that he lays out in his early work, is that fundamentally Burkeanism is a project that tries to sublimate social power or social institutions into authority, right, to make them authoritative. And this is an extraordinary project that he lays out very explicitly in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he says, whenever you set man over man, it is very important that you attach sublime qualities or sublime capacities to this person. Because if they do not seem to have these kinds of sublime qualities, then it's going to be very difficult for people to regard themselves as this individual subordinate. And what's fascinating about Burke is he never says that the person actually has to possess these sublime qualities in and of themselves, right? It's very possible that, yes, if you look past, the silly hat and, the royal stone or whatever it is that King Charles is sitting on, he really is just, a 70-ish-year-old guy who's probably got more than his fair share of extramarital affairs under his belt, right? However, if you strip away these sublime qualities, or what Burke calls all the pleasing illusions that make subordination easy, then what you're going to be left with is anarchy. Because the Enlightenment philosophers are committed to this idea, and here he is a little bit like Hume, that reason can fill in the gap, where this sublime sense of acquiescence to authority has usually functioned. But reason, in fact, is an extremely impoverished human capacity. It's also very individuated, and it pushes in different directions depending on who we talk to. So it's way better to rest with the pleasing illusions that have allowed our society to function than to challenge them in any kind of substantial way. And that's a pretty remarkable set of arguments to make, right? It's also worth noting that if you read the early essay on aesthetics, Burke also anticipates another kind of conservative aesthetics that's very popular, which is this emphasis on a kind of populist ruralism, or, the ordinary man. Because the other major category that he talks about in his work of aesthetics, in addition to this category of the sublime, is the beautiful. And the beautiful is what human reason has the capacity to actually understand, and that submits to our power easily. And a lot of the examples he gives in this early work of aesthetics, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, are things that are homely, gardening, flowers, music, convention, the things that people are able to understand. So when you see conservatives today talk about country life in these kind of beatific terms, then they're very clearly drawing upon this Burkean heritage of saying that these these beautiful things are beautiful precisely because they're simple, they're understandable. There might not be some deep truth to them, but they present themselves in ways that we can understand. Whereas those people and those institutions that have power in our society they're supposed to be sublime. They are supposed to overwhelm our capacity to understand. And precisely because they overwhelm the capacity of reason to understand them, we can only feel compelled to submit to them, right? And you see so many conservative authors going back and forth between these two different aesthetic modes of presentation over the course of a 200-year history. And Burke deserves a lot of the credit, and I would add a huge amount of the blame for contributing this to the history of thought.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, there's this incredibly cringy passage in Reflections on the Revolution in France about Marie Antoinette that's like, if
1,000 swords, would race to her defense, but the age of chivalry is gone. That one, right?
Yeah. It's like that. There's like a genre of like YouTube videos where like an actress will read like the sort of weirdest like things that her online simps have said about on her, online comments, and it's like you can sort of imagine Marie Antoinette reading that one off, But
funny thing is, Burke's editor actually suggested that he cut that line because even though he was sympathetic to the argument, he was like, "I think this is just a little too much." And when you're editor in the 18th century, is like, it's just too much patriarchy, man. Like, you really got to rein it back a little bit. But Burke was like, no, it's going in there. So,
yeah. Which is kind of funny. It's like, it's like, oh, did he understand himself to be in the grips of a pleasing illusion? What's going on here? But yeah, so there are two, so there's the side of Burke that's anticipated by Hume, which is the side where he's like, look, sure, sometimes, you need social change. Like I'll grant you that, progress can be good, but you want to go really slowly and not mess with these, institutions too much, that, you don't presume that you can like take them apart and put them back together again so they still work, and, and that like it's not going to lead to collapse or something worse. So there's that sort of pragmatic, like empiricist kind of side of Burke. But then there's this other side that you're identifying, which anticipates, I think, a lot of the most frightening things in later reaction thought. That's this aestheticization of politics. I mean, this is like this is like, when like Dugan, is going on about how it's really important to send traumatized conscripts without enough, ammunition to die for the sake of, pushing the final ceasefire line in the Donbass, like another half mile, toward the West. That's like, the sort of way he'll justify that is by this like aesthetic vision that it's like you should just like, just don't worry about all this petty human shit. Just like, zoom back until all you're seeing are these like mountain vistas and, and these marching legions of national greatness, and then you'll understand that this is a great thing to do.
Oh yeah. And you don't even need to go as esoteric as Dugan. Although I'm happy to go to that place. Donald Trump is a Burkean to his core, right? He's instinctive and he understands the power of sublimation. All you need to do is read his early book, The Art of the Deal, where he talks about truthful hyperbole, right? Where he says, I engage in an innocent type of exaggeration that I call truthful hyperbole. Really, his ghostwriter called it truthful hyperbole, but we won't go there, right? And Trump says, listen, people can't necessarily think big for themselves, ordinary people, but they get really excited by people who do think big, and they're willing to invest themselves in the kind of grand projects that these individuals will put forward. And that's a very Burkean idea, right? That shows you just how, from the very beginning, Trump was able to tap into this conservative instinct, which is why I don't really have a lot of truck for people on the right who will say Trump came out of nowhere. He doesn't really belong in our tradition. I'm like, Burke would have sat there, and even if he personally found Trump distasteful, I hope he would at least recognize that this idea of truthful hyperbole and myth-making surrounding himself is very much a form of sublimation. But there's one other thing that I think Burke is really important in terms of his contribution to political right for, which is Edmund Burke is one of the first people to really learn from the left and to draw upon its insights when making his own arguments. The kind of moderate Tory Edmund Neal talks about this in his book, Conservatism. It's just conservatism, where he says oftentimes what the right will do is try to develop inversions of progressive ideas in order to refute them, but also offer an alternative. And you see Burke doing this all throughout Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he'll say, listen, they're putting forward their idea of the rights of man that includes full participation for everybody, at least all white men, right?
Yeah.
I tell you that I have no problem with the so-called real rights of man. That's the term he uses. But I must deny that political participation for all is included amongst those rights for reasons that he never really gives, right? Or look at this idea of social contract put forward by Locke, Hobbes, and most infamously Rousseau. Burke says there's a contract, but it's not just between the living who can fiddle with it the way they want. It's a contract between the living, the dead, and those who are not yet to be born. What Mary Wollstonecraft called this kind of Gothic notion of a social contract. And of course, since a contract between the living, the dead, and those not yet to be born, there's very little that you can do to change it because it has this kind of cosmic immutability to it. And this is also not only a great example of where Burke takes a left-wing idea or progressive idea, this notion of the social contract, and tries to put it to conservative purposes. It's also a great example of why it is whenever people say, like, well, Burke is a more docile, prudent, less prone to exaggeration type figure than someone like Rousseau. I'm going to just read Reflections on the Revolution in France carefully. If you think that a normal social contract is kind of weird or a little bit unreal, now we have this kind of ghostly contract between all kinds of people who are dead, who are living, who are yet to be born. That's way more grandiose in terms of its connotations.
Yeah. That's fair. Well, we're gonna skip the entirety of the 19th century, both for the sake of time and also avoiding the giant argument about Nietzsche that we'd doubtless have if we did cover it.
I already got enough hate in my email about that, so yeah.
Fair enough. I did actually try to wrestle with this a little bit in the essay I wrote for your Nietzsche thing, but like I have a big enough soft spot for the guy that I want to, despite everything, and there's a lot for it to be despite, that I want to that I think some of the I might be motivated to read some of this stuff in a different way, but another day. We will stay instead in the British Isles and go to T.S. Eliot, which was a really interesting part of the book for me because I never thought about it in terms of like politics. It's just cool poetry, right? But I could still God, let's see. I don't know. Can close my eyes right now, see how much I can get through this. April's the cruelest month. Bringing lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. The summer we went to the Holiday. All right, fuck it. I'm done. It's been too long.
You just imagine Marlon Brando there, saying like, "We are the Hollow Men."
Yes. Good poem and good use of it in one of my favorite movies.
Really?
But I think that, like, talking about Eliot, he's interesting because in some ways, in certain respects, he's like, one of the most benign representatives of some pretty not great currents of thought that he like kind of sits at the center of, right? So like he doesn't unlike his buddy Ezra Pound, he doesn't side with the Axis in World War II.
That was a good decision.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. He gets all the not being a Nazi bonus points. And even there's this tension in a lot of what he says that you kind of identify and play with in the book, between the fact that he's like there's a lot going on with Eliot that's going to anticipate actually some of the more extreme figures you talk about later in the book, you know, the post-liberals. But like there's also this kind of, I don't know, like just aesthetic distaste for like getting too involved in the grubbiness of politics that like stops him from ever quite taking those instincts and running with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to make clear, I think T.S. Eliot is a brilliant poet. You know, he'd be top 5 for me as well, right? Particularly Proof Rock and After One Day and The Hollow Man. But the main thing that I draw on is his nonfiction writing, particularly the idea of Christian society, and Notes on a Culture, where he really lays out his political program. And it's worth noting that it's had a pronounced effect on generations of conservatives, not least Roger Scruton, who was a major inspiration for this section, where Scruton kind of nastily says, nobody on the left has ever reached the kind of depths of analysis that T.S. Eliot has been capable of. To which I, humbly posit, well, what about Leo Tolstoy? But we'll
Sure.
go there, right? The long story short of it is, Eliot perceives modern culture in the 20th century as moving in a lot of demotic directions that he doesn't like. And he means demotic in many sense, right? Yes, there's the advent of political democracy. He's very critical of this. But one of the things that's also singular about Eliot is he puts forward this idea that you can see elements of democratic society in things like the market or market society as well. Now, that might seem like an odd idea coming from a left perspective, where many of us are very critical of capitalism because it's not democratic enough, right? But from Eliot's standpoint, look, the pervasiveness of the market in the spheres of things like culture has resulted in the commodification of art and of culture. And the result has been a race to the lowest common denominator when it comes to things like the production of films, books, journalism, and of course poetry. And he thinks that we really need to push against this in some way, shape, or form. Now, like you mentioned, he's never quite sure how far he wants to go with this, because sometimes he'll make pretty radical sounding statements about the state that culture is in, that you might intuit, well, that's going to require some kind of radical solution. But then they'll very quickly say, but I'm not suggesting that, we withdraw from parliamentary institutions or that we take rights to expression away from people, not that. I'm just saying that we need to think about it, and it kind of leaves it to you to intuit what that means. But there's another kind of deeper problem that Eliot detects, which is that he associates the emergence of things like naturalistic materialism with the advent of nihilism. And he sees these as indistinguishable from the rise of demotic philosophies like liberalism, democracy, and socialism in the 20th century. So you can't disentangle them in some kind of clean way. And in the idea of a Christian society, he says, listen, there's this yearning for metaphysical meaning that the modern world simply is proven itself incapable of answering. And this is also one of the reasons why you see the decay of culture, since really we're running on fumes at this point, where people are just recycling Christian themes that they no longer believe in, or they're picking up on Nietzschean themes that are very dangerous if you look at something like the Nazis. So what we need to do is somehow restore a sense of Christian culture in British society, at the very least. And once again, in this book, he'll sometimes say, maybe we can lean in on doing some social conservative things, but I'm not suggesting that we withdraw from liberal rights because that would be too dangerous. I'm just floating these ideas out there. And I think that this really demonstrates a kind of reservation on his part, both because I think that Eliot could appreciate, in part because of the rivals that were emerging to Britain at the time, that there's something dangerous in putting forward a radical critique of your contemporary society, when some people might say, well, let's just go fascist then, like Pound did. Or they might just say, well, the solution to bourgeois decadent market society is communist society, where art will be elevated to new heights that we've never seen before, like a kind of Trotskyan thesis. Seen from those kind of standpoints, Eliot would say liberal, democratic, bourgeois society in Britain around the turn of the century would be pretty good, even if it's too crass for his taste. But I think the other reason is just he doesn't think that the poet's job is to sit there and really prescribe political solutions for the twos and fro's of what's going on. And I think that's also partly because Eliot was a bit of an elitist. And that's just the job for more pedantic, detail-oriented people than the poet, who's really supposed to be in touch with these grand metaphysical kinds of problems. But like you said, other people have not been both so humble and so arrogant in their inclinations. So many post-liberals have picked up on this idea of rejuvenating a a Christian society along Eliot lines, not least of which includes R. Reno, who basically wrote a sequel to Eliot's book, which he tweeted about today, where he says, amongst other things, that we are in the midst of a class war. Bourgeois decadent society is waging it against the lower classes. And the clearest example of that is that we are legalizing gay marriage, which is, for mysterious reasons, an affront to the poor.
Yeah. So we've actually got that that quote, the Rusty Reno, from your book, where you start talking about the post-liberals. You say as predominantly Roman Catholics, which, by the way, is one of the things that always confused me about American post-liberalism, that, like, to the extent that the goal seems to be like a Catholic theocracy, even beyond being a fairly secular society, etc., by historical standards, it's like these guys do know that, like, most religious people in the United States are Protestants, right? I think if you tore down the separation between church and state, you might not get results you'd like. But as predominantly, and also, like, okay, Republic of Ireland, place with many more devout Catholics in it than the United States. Gay marriage and abortion rights were both legalized last decade by referenda. So, the idea that they're going to be able to impose this stuff in the United States is just amazing to me. But anyway, it's a problem.
And I can tell you that, having been raised Roman Catholic, nothing will make you more critical of Roman Catholicism than being raised Roman Catholic most of the time. So let's just be clear on that.
Yeah. As predominantly Roman Catholics, many of the post-liberals echo the long-standing objection that liberalism and other progressive politics are fundamentally nihilistic, unable to provide meaning to human life by connecting individual activity to the plans of a transcendent deity. Life comes to lack a sublime or higher quality and becomes an empty pursuit of pleasure after pleasure, power after power. And, I'll just pause here and say, it's like, look, my critique of this is not that, like, the feeling that they're describing is totally foreign to me, right? Like, I get it.
No, of course not. I mean, anybody who sat there realizing that, we're on Survivor season 30 or whatever it happens to be, will probably sit there and think, wow, our society is producing a lot of crap culturally, right? And maybe we should do something about that and try to push things in a more elevated way. What's problematic for me about Eliot's analysis is I would foreground political economy as a basis for critiquing the emergence of something like, a decadent or mass culture, whereas he would ascribe it to things like liberal and demonic values. And I just don't think that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, Eliot is somebody who thinks the problem with with advanced capitalist democracies is that ordinary people who haven't even read any of his favorite Greek and Roman poets in the original have too much power and influence. There's a line, actually, this is in Christopher Hitchens' book, Why Orwell Matters, that he has this amazing detail about Orwell sending Eliot the manuscript for Animal Farm, and Eliot being like, well, I mean, look, it's obvious like the pigs should be in charge. You just need better pigs. So there you go.
That's funny. And I want to say one last thing. Eliot was unusual in this crowd in being distinctively honest about the problems with trying to reinstate something like a Christian society. And one of the throwaway lines that he gives that pretty much none of the post-liberals treat seriously is that he says, listen, it's not enough to want a Christian society. It's not enough even to say that we would be more moral or more elevated as a Christian society. Ultimately, what you have to do is prove the metaphysical truth of Christianity. And very few people, he points out, that are arguing for a Christian society in early 20th century England have the audacity or the capability of doing that, because that's too metaphysical, too complicated, and quite possibly doomed to failure. And it's worth noting that pretty much every post-liberal coming after him has not taken that challenge seriously, since 99% of their critiques of liberal society is, well, whether or not the scientific materialist mindset is true, we just really don't like it. So why don't we act like it's not true instead and just go back to St. Thomas Aquinas? Wouldn't that be a gas?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of that. And it's like, it's sort of this weirdly like utilitarian, like all that matters is, is how you feel sort of view of this, that like, well, hold on. I mean, I don't want to go with the experience machine. I want to be in touch with objective external reality, even if it's not always fun. So
it's worth noting that the few people who have tried to do this haven't really been all that convincing. Like John Finnis, God bless him, really tried to resuscitate Thomistic philosophy for the 20th century. John Milbank did the same thing in his Theology and Social Theory. And just none of them have been particularly intellectually satisfying. So credit where due, there have been a few people taking stabs at trying to resuscitate Thomism and Aristotelianism for the modern era. They haven't really been successful. But who knows? Maybe in the long-term future.
Yeah. We'll
give them another 1,000 years or so.
Sure. Yeah. So that line about the pleasure after pleasure, power after power. I was thinking about many years ago, sitting on the couch when I was in graduate school with another grad student and watching TV, and we just watched some. We're just watching some commercials, not even remember what the commercial that sparked this comment was, but my friend was sitting next to the couch, is like, see, Ben, this is why we need capitalism, because life is innate, we live in an innately meaningless universe, and with any other system we might forget it, but like this just rubs it in our face all the time.
Yeah.
But
when you realize like Fast and the Furious 10 is actually gonna be Fast and the Furious 11 and Fast and the Furious 12, you're like, God, there is no meaning. Everything is permitted. We're just going to get these movies ad infinitum. Just fucking kill me now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We live in a Dostoevskian universe in, the most nihilistic sense.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, going back to the quote we had after that said, what gives the better post-liberal condemnations force beyond the kind of moralistic and elitist objections we've seen from Maestre through T.S. Eliot, is their ability to develop an immanent critique of liberalism, which purports to explain its failures in terms of its very successes. In worse hands, and you're about to go on to the next guy we're going to talk about, which is Patrick Deneen, which are the better hands. But, in the worst hands, this is nothing more than the perversity of rhetoric dolled up with conventional reactionary appropriations of populist liberal and left rhetoric. A good example of this can be seen in Rusty Reno's claim that the, quote, class war, a war on the weak, is epitomized by the campaign for gay marriage. Marriage has become another plastic, open-ended option for the upper class. This one of my favorite lines of the book. You say here, the only response is to express amusement. That one could even think that the biggest problem facing the poor is the prospect of a man marrying another man and not being poor.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but like when you read Rusty's book, he really tries very hard to make this whole populism thing work. And I'm going to date myself here, but like the whole time I was just going back to Mean Girls and be like, stop trying to make out that like being homophobic is some kind of class war. It's just not gonna fucking happen, man. It's never gonna happen. Let it die.
Yeah.
Or at least do what Deneen does, like attach your kind of social conservatism to like a genuine economic program that gives you a little bit of street cred when it comes to giving a shit about the lower orders, right? But sitting there from on high being like, we'll worry about that whole you're poor thing later on, but the number one thing I'm going to do for you right now is roll back Lawrence v. Texas.
Exactly.
Great. That'll really put food on everyone's table, won't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even Deneen is pretty half-hearted about it. We'll, and by the way, I realized earlier that I was stumbling because I was going straight from straight to the summer, but we skipped right past winter kept us warm, feeding a little life with dry tubers. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and drank coffee and talked for an hour. So I really liked that poem way back when.
I could see that.
But a lot of the rest of Eliot too.
Oh yeah, no, he's a great poet, right? And I mean, look, don't take my condemnations of his politics as a reason not to go read, Ash Wednesday or The Hollow Men. If anything, there are far worse ways to spend your summer than going through the great works of Eliot's maturity.
Yeah. Okay.
Just don't become a reactionary.
Yeah, it's I just read quick, was talking day before yesterday to friend of show Nathan Robinson. He was giving me shit about living in LA, and he said that they don't have any bookstores, whatever. And I'll grant you there are very few bookstores, but the LA Public Library is fucking magnificent.
Tanning salons, but on the other hand,
there was a like the central building or whatever, the LA Public Library is like several floors and big escalators, glass elevator. It's got like way better than most university library selection. And I was just there, and I picked up Michelle Hallbuck's book, Elementary Particles, and our producer Jordan, I think saw me read it. She's like, "Oh, how is that?" I was like, it's like, look, I like it as a novel. I pretty much think the only thing stopping Hallbeck being from being a fascist is these two nihilistic for fascism, because that would be like a political program, So I think you could separate these issues a little bit when you're evaluating works of art, but I do want to go to so we're going to go over time. That's okay, but I do want to go to our last few in our little tour, starting with the guy we've already teased quite a bit, Patrick Deneen. Mm-hmm. So tell me about Deneen, because like one of the things that I think is a telling point you make in this is that like the sort of term that people like Deneen, and his ilk like to use to describe their politics is post-liberalism. Mm-hmm. But it's a little bit of a funny term, because like post-liberalism makes it sound like you've like, I don't know, sublimated liberalism, that you've like gone through it and you've absorbed the best of it and you've transcended it, gone beyond it. Whereas like a lot of this stuff, it's like, well, we don't like market society because it's too atomized, but we're also not socialists. And we also think that like, the church should get to decide, what forms of birth control you could use. Like, it doesn't really sound like there's anything post about it. Like this sounds much more like a revived pre-liberalism.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're post-liberals in the same way that Peter Lawler, who was an influence on them, was a postmodern conservative, right? He was intending to reject modernity, not transcend it. And for the most part, what the post-liberals want to do is reject liberalism, keep a few of its institutions and its insights, but really go back to something that's considerably more antiquarian. But look, I wrote this section prior to the publication of Deneen's most recent book, which is an important book called Regime Change. Which actually my review just came out, I guess last night. So people are wondering what my developed thoughts are on this. They can go check that out for the Institute for Christian Socialism. But in this book, I really focus on his work from Democratic Faith up until Why Liberalism Failed, which is the book that really made him famous. And I want to be very clear. I think that Patrick Deneen, after the death of Roger Scruton, is probably the greatest Anglo-American conservative philosopher. He's a very sharp guy. He's very well read. And he does take the left more seriously than 99% of conservatives out there, including Karl Marx. If you read his latest book, he has some important things to say about Marx, which includes acknowledging that if you're committed to a traditional communitarian society, maybe a revolutionary mode of production isn't the best thing to have as your background political economy. So props to that. He's done his homework. 99.9% of conservatives don't. And I commend him for that. That's about as far as it goes, though. So I make the argument that in democratic faith, he develops one good critique of the left. And I use the term expansively here to include liberalism, Democrats, and progressivism, where he says, listen, there has long been this expectation on the part of people like Trotsky or Dewey, or for that matter, Walt Whitman, that equality will not only be fairer and not only be more productive, but will also elevate human beings or the mass of people in a way, perfect them in a kind of fashion that no other political institution can. And, a good example of this would be Trotsky's famous essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he explicitly tries to refute Nietzsche which is a valuable thing to do, by the way. I'm not saying, Trotsky was misguided in wanting to do that, where he says, under socialist conditions or under communist conditions, every human being will rise to the height of a Marx, Aristotle, a Goethe, and beyond that, further heights will still be achieved. And Deneen says, listen, that is unlikely to happen under any system of government, including an egalitarian system of government. We would be far better off making an argument for equality rather than on the basis that will perfect people, stressing the fact that we share human fallibilities together, that all of us are going to suffer, all of us are going to die, all of us are going to get sick and see our loved ones removed, and that's a reason to emphasize human equality. And that argument in democratic faith is something that I actually have a fair bit of sympathy towards. And I know you and I have talked about this before. I'm entirely willing to say that under my liberal democratic socialism or democratic socialism, plenty of people will take the opportunity to spend more time with their families, spend more time drinking wine on a beach, spend more time traveling the world, and that's entirely fine with me. If you want to use the opportunities that we make available to you to play video games all day, then by all means, go ahead, right? That's your vision of the good life. I don't begrudge you that. But things really become problematic by the time you get to why liberalism failed, where he makes this argument that the kind of metaphysical underpinnings of liberalism lie in ultimately the advent of scientific materialism, which rejected this old teleological scholastic worldview. And what you get instead is this belief that the world is just matter and motion, this kind of Newtonian, Baconian worldview. And matter and motion has no intrinsic meaning to it. All that we can really do is manipulate it to gratify hedonistic human desires, right? This kind of very crude Hobbesian kind of ethic. And he says that this was the centerpiece from which liberalism grew. And not coincidentally, the early liberal thinkers in the classical tradition said that people should be free to pursue their desires without the state interfering in any meaningful way to push them to any artificial vision of the good life, because the only thing that really counted was utility maximization, and people need to be relatively free in order to pursue that. And then later on, he says, you might think that philosophical liberalism or egalitarian liberalism, the stored embodied by people like John Stuart Mill or John Rawls, broke from this classical liberal paradigm of emphasizing individual freedom in the pursuit of utilities by demanding the big state interfere with the economy. But Deneen says, actually, this is a continuation of the same liberal mindset, because what you see people doing is actually saying, left to our own devices, we are unable to pursue happiness as effectively as we would like. So we need the state to provision an array of public goods so that we can better gratify our hedonistic desires. And Deneen, being a social conservative, says this has ended in things like demanding public stipends to transform our bodies in certain kinds of ways, certain kinds of perverting ways, he thinks. No points if you get the reference to, being wary of the trans revolution, right? And what he says is we need to do is reject this and ultimately move back to what he calls a mixed regime or Aristopopulism, where rather than having a neoliberal elite at the helm of the state, instead we're going to appoint a new conservative ruling class that he believes at least is going to be more in touch with the instinctively conservative masses and that will guide them to the creation of new communities oriented around a fundamentally socially conservative worldview. And this is going to have certain kind of economically egalitarian features to it, but nothing that you and I would regard as really all that ambitious. I mean, in my latest review, I point out that basically what he's calling for is a return to the economics of the Eisenhower administration, because we don't even get something like universal healthcare, let alone universal post-secondary education. What we get is an effort to try to make sure that everyone has a meaningful job. Workers will be able to have a higher degree of social capital, but not actual capital. And again, this is primarily so that they can militate against woke corporations if they want. And there'll be certain economic policies really modeled off of Poland and Hungary that will offer certain kinds of economic redistribution if you're willing to conform to social conservative expectations like family formation. And for me, beyond just the fact that the liberal instincts I have militate very strongly against any kind of social conservatism, the socialist in me is just like, that's not any kind of radical political economy at all. A return to the economics of the Eisenhower administration, to me, just really means a return to the world's crappiest welfare state, even looking at West European models, and we can do an awful lot better than that.
Yeah. Amen to that. So a couple corrections in the chat. One of them was for me. Michelle Welbeck is how you pronounce that dude's name. I think he was doing it quasi phonetically and also influenced by a joke that my ex-wife always made about him, he's like, who's that guy you're reading? Is this, what is that? Hollaback girl? That's the,
Yeah.
And then the Soul of Man Under Socialism, that's Oscar Wilde, but I do know the Trotsky you're talking about, where he says, like, in like an advanced communist society, like every man will be a Goethe, every man will be a Marx, whatever. It's like,
oh yeah, that's right. Oscar Wilde did The Soul of Man Under Socialism. I can't remember the name of the Trotsky.
Yeah, I was just trying to look it up on the fly, and I can't, but I definitely remember that line from Trotsky.
It's part of the line.
No, it's a good line. I think it's bullshit, but I think it's a good line. There's I'm with you. I mean, I think that if you sort of free people up to do whatever, you'll have a range, and and that's fine. I mean, like, and I'm not actually a big. I've never really been that inclined towards the sort of new socialist man kind of vision of socialism. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of actually I was thinking about this. Looking at your book to get ready for this, in the David Hume thing, you've got a line up in there about, taking, drawing Tory conclusions from Whig premises. And I think maybe I've always been inclined to draw Bolshevik conclusions from Tory premises, which, in the sense that it's like, yeah, look, I agree with all the stuff about human fallibility and,
me too. Yeah.
all that, right? I think, I think I'm an atheist, but I sort of think original sin is the least implausible part of Christianity. I think that, people will often, there's human nature is complicated. People will often be selfish and cruel to each other, etc. That's why we need to equalize power as much as possible to stop too much of it from being accumulated in any in some people's hands, so they'll abuse it with others. That's that's hence democratic socialism. You don't trust any party that claims to rule on behalf of the people, and hence capitalism isn't okay, because capitalists have way too much power over workers and communities. But the one thing I did want to, before we moved on from Deneen, the one other thing I wanted to say is that in your discussion of both Eliot and Deneen, you have, one of the things you really take them to both to task for is that, in a weird way, not really taking Christianity seriously, that it's sort of you kind of get the sense that what T.S. Eliot liked about high church Anglicanism was the sort of pageantry associated with the sense of transcendence, but it sort of could have been anything, and with and then maybe even more so with Deneen, it's like, look, if what you really like about Christianity is that it's sort of socially useful for everybody to believe this, this is not, this is certainly missing the boat on a lot of what's supposed to be most distinctive about this religion.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think these are important things to talk about when we have a Christian socialist who's running for president right now, Dr. Cornel West, right? Because one of the things that really I found distasteful about Eliot's kind of high Anglican Christianity was precisely that he really focuses on the more rarefied forms of culture that he imagines would emerge in an authentically Christian civilization. The kind of things that you would see during the medieval era, like the Summa Theologica, right? Now, I'm not disputing the fact that those are valuable, even invaluable cultural contributions, but it's really important to stress that if you look at the Bible, Jesus was a lot less concerned with the production of high cultural artifacts than he was with feeding the many, talking about how the wretched of the earth would know that God was on their side, laying down his life for his fellow human beings, or for his creation, depending on how you interpret, the humanity or divinity of Christ. Those are the kinds of things that are central to the Christian message. And it's really not something that comes through very much at all with Eliot's kind of, I don't want to call it sneering, but certainly powdery kind of wariness of ordinary people. And I think that this is also the problem I have with elements of Deneen's work as well. Now, it's not nearly as pronounced in Deneen's work, because I think that he genuinely does care about the lower orders. But I do think that sitting there being like, hey, in my future Aristopopulist society, the ruling conservative elite will take a shop class so that they'll know what they're going to, what it's like to work with their hands. They're not going to actually cede power, and we're not actually going to redistribute wealth in any kind of meaningful way, but you'll get to know that. That's really not all that substantial to me. And one of the key figures in the book that kind of lurks in the background, particularly in the sections on Dostoevsky, is Leo Tolstoy, who I point out was really much more radical in his interpretation of the Christian message, and calling for an end to state violence, and calling for an end to imperialism, and calling for the widespread redistribution of wealth to the Russian peasantry, in addition to an elimination of all aristocracies. And I think that if you want to take Christianity seriously the way that Tolstoy does, then really what comes across in Deneen and Eliot's work is actually, almost paradoxically, this kind of wariness or concern about going too far. Whereas I would say, if this is really what you want, then let's go that far, right? Let's eliminate the aristocracy and imperialism, make the rich of the earth central to our moral outlook. Those would all be good things that any democratic socialist could get behind.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, is a big theme throughout the book is that a lot of conservative attitudes towards those lower orders are kind of schizophrenic, that like if that on the one hand, to the extent that people are staying in place and doing what they're told, not questioning social arrangements, there are these panegyrics to the sort of simple wisdom of the man on the street, who knows better than to question everything like these radical intellectuals, but then as soon as the man on the street, goes on strike or starts, marching for, land, peace, and bread in 1917 or whatever, then very quickly they become the swinish multitude, because, conservatism has lots and lots of rhetorical resources for that one too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the swinish multitude, the herd, the mass. I spent the whole week reading Bronze Age Pervert for another project. The yeast, the bugmen, there are just voluminous terms of disdain for ordinary people in the conservative tradition. And this is one of the reasons why I think that Nietzsche, and I know we don't get into him, at least was insightful when he pointed out that there's an elective affinity, at the very least, between liberalism, socialism, democracy, and at least many facets of Christianity, particularly its concern for the wretched of the earth. And at least he was consistent in saying, we need to go back to the world of Achilles, at least with a more rarefied kind of soul, because Achilles didn't give a shit about all that. He just wanted to dominate over, the ordinary herd of people, and nature entitled him to do so, right? I think that a lot of these so-called Christian conservatives are really very willing to read the parts of the Bible that foreground things like being skeptical of homosexuality, but that stuff about how it's easier for the camel to cross through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. That's meant to be interpreted metaphorically, right?
Yeah. The six sentences of the Old plus New Testament that mention homosexuality are really important, and the 10,000 or so that mention poverty, are kind of optional. Yeah, I mean, look, they something I talk about in the Hitchens book is, given a choice between like atheistic libertarians who are trying very hard to achieve a society in which people will be selling their organs for Bitcoin to make rent, and the vision of somebody like the aforementioned Brother West, right? I certainly don't hesitate about which of those I like better. Producer Jake in the chat says, question for Matt, huge Tolstoy fan. Would you ever consider writing a book about him?
I have, actually. In fact, one of my forthcoming projects is going to be a Dostoevsky-Tolstoy comparison. I'm not ready to write that yet because those Russian novels are large. So it's going to take me a while to go through them again and really sort through what I think. But I think what Tolstoy really does extremely effectively is offer a look into the soul, if you want to call it, of a leftist, right, or a progressive thinker who really had profound insights into humankind. And I think it's time for a look back at the kind of insights that he offers progressives in books like, not just War and Peace, but his nonfiction like The Kingdom of God is Within You. So one day, let's hope.
Nice. I would read the shit out of that. All right. So we do need to wrap up, but I think this would be incomplete without these last two, since something that we've kind of remarkably spent no time talking about in an extended discussion of the history of right-wing thought is nationalism. And so we've got two people for that. One Nazi and one Jew. Let's start let's start with the latter. We have Yoram Hazony, who is a very smart, a very pleasant guy in personal interactions. I have like I said, I've sat down with the guy and had a riveting conversation about Hume. If I like post a picture on Twitter of me like lighting Hanukkah candles with my dad, he'll like say something nice about it. And he'll politely ignore the 10,000 times I post that Israel's an apartheid state.
Actually, he and I have been bonding recently over a disdain for right-wing anti-Semitism, which is very much gone viral. So
yeah, which is also, although it is, look, there's an element of leopards eating people's faces, and who could or could not have seen that come in some of this, but yeah, lovely human being, bad political worldview, and one of the things that is interesting about this, that is actually kind of how some of the recent anti-Semitism stuff has come up, is that Yoram is probably the most important intellectual leading light of what's called national conservatism. And national conservatism is kind of a hilariously internationalist movement.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, I think here there's two important things to say, right? Which is that Yoram's first book, The Virtue of Nationalism, was really a kind of underdeveloped version of the theory that he really kind of put flesh on the bones of in Conservatism, a Rediscovery. It's important to understand his account of nationalism in light of this bigger book that really provides the philosophical and theoretical justification for the more historical and normative and international arguments that he puts forward in the earlier text. So a quick summary of his work is that Yoram falls into a broadly Burkean tradition of conservatism that he describes as historical empiricism, where he insists that, look, human reason, at least as understood by the rationalist tradition within Western thought, is fundamentally a corrosive thing. It has its uses in very limited contexts, but we can see that whenever somebody is appealing to transcendent or rationalistic notions of reason and saying that they are in touch with some kind of universalistic truth, in fact, all of their different universalistic and rational truths tug in very different directions. So rather than putting our faith in this and recognizing that this is corrosive of established authorities, instead we should put our faith in this kind of historical empiricist insight that institutions and traditions that have proven themselves enduringly over a long period of time within the context of our nation are what is worthwhile in terms of demanding our political allegiances. Now, I have a lot of big problems with this. The first and most important one at a metaphysical level that I pointed out in my review of this book and in this new text is that for a historical empiricist, there's something really odd about leaning very heavily on this idea of the nation. Yes. Fundamentally, the nation is not an empirical entity, right? Certainly not in the sense that a table is an empirical entity or you and I are an empirical entity. It's about as abstract an ideal as you can possibly imagine. Benedict Anderson rightly described it as an imagined community, right? The nation only exists as long as we project its existence into being and as long as we operate along the kind of imagined contours that we project. The minute that we stop believing that we are a nation, whether it's, the nation of America or the LCD sound system nation, of which I am a proud member, then it ceases to be, right? So methodologically, there's a big problem there. Because one of the things that I point out is, look, if really what you're just saying is that we need to be part of some kind of community, or we need to feel some sense of belonging with a group that is larger than us, then no socialist would actually deny that, right?
Sure.
If anything, we would absolutely emphasize.
I've got one for you. Yeah.
Exactly, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is something that really drives me crazy about this. Like, so I was, last summer, I was going to do this written and then verbal debate with Yoram that was going to be hosted by
Don't remind me of that.
Mario Magazine. And it fell through for various reasons on various sides of it we don't need to get into, but I did write the first part of it, right, which is a response to an excerpt from his book. And one of the things that I got into there that like kind of drives me crazy about some of the narrative he pushes about this is that the sort of association of empiricism with conservatism is like just in terms of the data of the history of philosophy, it just doesn't map at all.
Yeah, and he really struggles to try to make it map because he doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about people like Locke, for example. But I'm pretty sure Locke was an empiricist, right?
Yeah, Locke is the most important empiricist, so if like, in fact, I mean, yeah, you think you think the sort of three. Maybe in the history of Anglophone liberalism, three of the very most important guys, right? The three Johns, Locke, Stuart Mill, and Rawls. There's the first, Locke is, as I said, maybe like, maybe the most important empiricist, like kind of to empiricism, what like Descartes is to rationalism, and also one of the most important figures in the history of liberalism. Stuart Mill is super duper empiricist. In fact, in some ways, like more than almost any other empiricist, like he really.
Oh yeah, he's a fallibilist. I mean, he really anticipates Popper's argument that, drawing upon Hume, that we can never actually prove our empirical hypotheses in any kind of robust way. All that we can be sure of is that we haven't seen them being disproven yet.
Yeah,
which is one of the arguments he makes for why it is that we should have liberty. We need to run an awful lot of experiments to see what kinds of good life are conducive to human flourishing.
Yeah, I mean, the classical like 18th century empiricists were willing to say, okay, at least like logical, mathematical, kinds of truths, at least those are non-empirical. And, John Stuart Mill tries very hard to say, no, those are empirical too. Exactly the same, as any other knowledge. It's all ultimately based on observation of the material world. And then Rawls doesn't really get into the sort of issues that I think are dividing empiricists and rationalists. I think that
I should add though, even on the rationalist front, this is one of the things that I point out also, right? Like, it's not like you can accuse Descartes or Kant, for God's sake, of having an excess of faith in the power of human reason to understand and remake the world. I mean, if anything, Marx actually makes this point very effectively.
Kant's book isn't an uncritical celebration of human understanding, critical celebration of pure reason, right? That's I mean, Kant is all about understanding the limits of reason, and Kant is ultimately a sort of very cautious kind of liberal, like in his own sort of way, drawing some, it's like as the conclusion somehow always managed to be that like the King of Prussia is fine, but
fine, just fine,
but yeah, like you certainly think about other big rationalists. It's like, okay, so like you think that like Leibniz spent his time like spent his time pushing for like a new crusade against, the Muslim world, is like certainly nobody you could really mistake for being a liberal. So yeah, like the sort of mapping onto the history of philosophy of this distinction is kind of crazy to me. And then this idea, forget that. Okay, look, his favorite conservatives are empiricists, and fine, right? But like but even there, there's a lot of what they're like this idea that it's like, okay, well, you just should like, be deferential to like ancient wisdom because, you shouldn't trust yourself to be able to take apart the machinery of society, put it back again together again so it still works, whatever. It's like, well, I mean, if you're going to say, well, liberalism is this big dangerous thing because it establishes, it like disrupts established certainties. Nationalism is only about as old as liberalism is. Like they came into the world together, and by the way, they came, nationalism comes into the world through revolution. It's not like this was some sort of glacial evolution of like something that had existed before. I mean, nationality in the modern sense was a revolutionary project in the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, like
I always say there's a reason that every fucking nationalist movement decided to drop the tricolor as their pattern, right? It wasn't because they were trying to emulate Prussia in terms of their political organization. It's because they thought that the French Revolution was a pretty fucking cool thing.
Yeah, exactly. And like one of the things like I always think about from Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast is like, one of the points he makes there is like, even like the idea that there's like a unitary French nation or even a unitary French language. I mean, that was like a creation of a revolutionary project that the Jacobins like very intentionally for political reasons, standardized all of this stuff. I mean, in 1789, if you went from village by village from Paris to Rome, every village you got closer to Rome, like what people were speaking sounded a little bit more like what we would think of as Italian and a little bit less like what we thought of as French, like you only really get a homogenous uniform French language because that's an intentional Jacobin political project. And like, I like the point Sohrab Ahmari made in his essay on national conservatism at Compactor is like, look, if, in the 19th century, guardians of established order understood liberalism and nationalism to be twin subversive ideologies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is where I take issue with the historical part, Hazoni's historical empiricism, because one of the major arguments he makes for nationalism and the virtue of nationalism and conservatism and rediscovery is that it seems to work pretty well. And one of the big ways that it seems to work, according to him at least, is that nationalist states won't necessarily be imperialist and engage in grand projects of imperial expansion. But what's odd then is the couple of the examples of nation states that he brings up include little countries that refrain from imperialism, like France, Britain, Israel, the United States, all of which, as you know, never engaged in any kind of imperial projects whatsoever, but actually just stayed resolutely within their borders and just engaged in local skirmishes to try to preserve their national integrity. So I said, look, if you actually take seriously this idea that we should evaluate nationalism empirically on whether or not it inhibits things like imperialist projects, it has a really crappy record in a lot of respects. I mean, even the kind of liberal nationalism of the French, which I actually have quite a few good things to say about, was infamously imperialist, right? Spreading all across Europe. And you can really see him try to hedge some of these points, not very effectively, because, of course, one of the gigantic problems looming is when it comes to things like German nationalism, which, he obviously has very good reasons to be personally concerned about. But he says, listen, I understand that people might think that Nazism was a kind of nationalism. But actually, because Nazism was inherently an imperialist kind of doctrine that wanted to establish a global world order, it's not really nationalism in the sense that I'm talking about. So it doesn't count. And my response to that is, I'm like, that's about as no true Scotsman, kind of approach to the dangers of nationalism as you can possibly get. Because I seem to remember that the Nazis like to say things like Deutschland über alles pretty consistently. and didn't seem to think that their imperialism was disconnected from their belief that Germany was the central spiritual heart of Europe and was destined to rule the world in some kind of way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, look, the list of nationalisms that once they gain enough power to do so, engage in some sort of expansionism is kind of all of them.
Yeah.
That's like, and if you're going to do historical empiricism, I mean, that's not as, like, I can get behind saying, history is a series of experiments. You see, how they run. I do think that Hazoni is dodging some more philosophically basic issues, because you still need to have a separate argument about values to decide what counts as success or failure in your experiment. But but I can sort of get behind the basic experimental framework. But if you're just going to say, well, like, some pretty obvious experimental data, like right now, the world is closer to the brink of extinction than it's been in my lifetime, because of this superpower confrontation that started with with a right-wing nationalist government in Russia invading Ukraine. That seems to go in the bad column as far as like the experimental data on nationalism, because, well, that doesn't count. It's like, well, if you're just going to say that none of the none of the results that you don't like really count, then like it seems like you're not actually being an empiricist anymore.
No, you're developing your kind of own rationalistic view of what nationalism should be, and say, let's just try to wedge the world into this model, because I think it would be preferable. And I don't think it would be preferable. But if that's your project, then at least say that. Don't try to imply that Great Britain, which created the largest empire in human history, spanning all across the globe, was not motivated by imperialism because they happen to have certain kind of nationalist sentiments. It's just bizarre, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're past 10:30 on the East Coast. We do need to wrap up, but I don't think we can do this without doing the last guy on our list, and the last thing you talk about in the book. Somebody who has never once wished me a happy Hanukkah on Alexander Dugan, and that's and like, okay, so the sort of through line here is obviously nationalism, but whereas, like, man, at least if I'm trying to argue with Hazoni, I can sort of say, hey, you want to be an empiricist? I would read the evidence differently. That's like, but at least I can sort of see what we're arguing about. With Dugan, it's that I don't know, oceans of blood are fine if the way that they sound when the blood swishes around, echoes to music of national greatness. It's really hard to see what you can do about that in terms of trying to engage or push back on it. And I also, I guess, want to say that I'm somebody who my instinct is always to, like, whatever the question is fill in the blank a fascist? My instinct is always, probably not, right? Like, it's I think that the sort of way that a lot of 21st century discourse is attached to, like, that analogy is unhealthy. I think that throwing it around for everything actually weakens its power. I think it's often kind of intellectually lazy, that there are read Matt's book. There are centuries of shitty and horrible reactionary views and movements, and that, like, things can be similar to. You don't always have to compare everything to this one period in the 1920s and 30s. There are lots of ways for things to be bad without
that's sure.
Without being fascist. But reading the Dugan sections at the end of the book, I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, as the jackboot really could not fit more snugly in this particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm completely with you. Look, years of studying the right has made me at least appreciate that the right is as if not more diverse than the left in a lot of respects. And I say potentially more diverse because the right, wherever it's emerged, has drawn very heavily upon relative and specific cultural and nationalist conditions to try to argue for the retention or expansion of various kinds of social power in hierarchically organized ways. So the right is a very diverse set of ideas. It's a very diverse political alignment, and it looks different wherever you go. Fascism is just one species of right-wing thought, and it has very specific permutations. And I really resent the fact that anytime somebody puts forward hard right ideas, we immediately leap to that label. But sometimes it is warranted. And in Dugan's case, I think it absolutely is warranted to call him a fascist. So my definition of fascism draws very heavily on Roger Griffin's, who essentially argues that we need to understand fascism in terms of its constructive project as a form of what he calls palingenetic ultranationalism. And what this basically means in plain English is that fascists project this myth or idea of the ultranation, which usually doesn't conform to the specific national boundaries which they feel themselves constrained by. But the ultranation gives meaning and vitality to life. And it's supposed to elevate ordinary people, and I stress ordinary people, above their own mundane existence by allowing them to participate in something that's greater than them, the ultranation. And palingenesis refers to this idea of rebirth or resurgence. And the basic idea is that our grand, glorious ultranation has been wronged, has been defiled, has been humiliated, and this is largely at the hands of liberal and leftist forces, both externally and externally. We're absolutely on the nice edge of falling into a period of irredeemable decline. But if we give ourselves over to the fascist movement, then the ultranation can be restored. Our people will once more be elevated. We will, of course, crush the decadent democratic, leftist, communist, liberal forces that oppose us. And, if you're Germany or Dugan, our country will rule the world, and everything will be hunky-dory after those noteworthy rivers of blood are shed. And this is a very distinctive idea of how the world operates, palingenetic ultranationalism. And by no means every hard right or radical right figure conforms to it. For instance, I don't think that Nietzsche conforms to this idea of being a fascist thinker, even though he was a big influence on it. But Dugan clearly does, right? So in his book, Foundations of Geopolitics, what really comes through is this idea that Russia is in a period of decline. It's lost its empire to the Americans, who have advanced and humiliated it in every conceivable way. And what's worse, Russia at that very moment is internalizing the value system of the enemy, liberalism and capitalism. Both of these are very foreign to Russia's way of organizing things. That's one of the reasons why the country has kind of lost faith in itself. And what it needs to do is resurge in important ways by establishing this Eurasian Union or Eurasian Empire, however you want to connote it, in alliance with various other reactionary and anti-liberal forces around the globe, including white nationalists, Islamic fundamentalists, all kinds of good people, you name it, right? And once the Eurasian Union, the Eurasian Empire has achieved enough power, it will confront the decadent, liberal, socialist, materialist nations of the Atlantic world. Rivers of blood will be shed. They will all be condemned to hell. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. There's a long passage in the book where he talks about this, because fascists love revenge fantasies, right? And then, Eurasia will rule the world. And Russia's confidence in herself will be restored. And every now and then he gestures this idea that this would be a beneficent thing for the peoples of the world, because the Atlantic world is so defined by this decadence, materialism, nihilism. At other points, he'll try to imply that he's a relativist or a postmodernist. So he really doesn't have a problem with the Atlantic states doing what they want to do within their own constrained borders, as long as Eurasian civilization is able to do what it wants within its borders. But of course, since the Atlantic regimes will not allow Russia to do what it wants within its borders, the military confrontation is still necessary, right? And this is really important in trying to understand his conception of what's going on in the Ukraine. because anybody who's followed Dugan online, which I don't recommend you do, might be surprised that he's paying so much attention to what looks like a local war. But the reason is because he fundamentally sees this as pretty much a cosmic confrontation, or the first stage in a cosmic confrontation between the Atlantic nations, or between the West and Russia, that he's ultimately convinced that Russia is going to win, or that it must win if it's going to redeem itself before it goes on to redeem the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember what you just said is something that last time Slavoj was on the show, he nailed him on, that, that it's like Dugan is a postmodern relativist when it's convenient for his argument, and then he stops.
Always when it's convenient.
Then he like very dramatically stops being one when it's not, and then it's like then it's not like, oh well, you have your way of doing things and we have ours, and there's no standard of judgment or whatever. Then suddenly it's that the West is satanic, and it needs to be crushed for that reason. Okay. Yeah, I guess maybe last thought about this. I think you sort of think about reasons to take an interest in the details of right-wing thought, and one of them, obviously the one that's sort of most central to our core brand proposition here, is that you need to understand them to argue effectively against them. But there's also, I think maybe in a weird way, well, different ways for different ones of these guys, but in a weird way, maybe even most of all for your Dugan types. Like, I think that there's just sort of something about like looking into that distorted mirror of like, this is this is what the world looks like without like certain really basic premises about human equality, etc. Is like can maybe help you think a little bit harder about what you believe and why you believe it.
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the things that I consistently say, right? One of the things that occurred to me when I was writing this project was I did have more respect for the intellectual aptitudes of the right. Not everybody that I talk about in the book, but a lot of figures on the right, writing about them, thinking through them, and trying to figure out how to respond to them. But ultimately, for any progressive, what really occurred to me at the end was I wasn't more convinced by conservatism or the right at the end of it. If anything, I was more convinced by liberalism and progressivism at the end of it, because my own belief system had been clarified through this contest of ideas. Because fundamentally, I don't think, and this is the kind of discussion that opens the book, that there are demonstrably superior people. In the sense that there are people whose lives matter more than others, or people whose existence has more cosmic significance than anyone else. I think that the humblest person in the streets of Niger or on the streets of LA has just as much of an entitlement to lead a good life as I do, or as King Charles does, or as Alexander Dugan maybe does. And that's a fundamental moral conviction that I happen to have. And ultimately, I also just think that it's true from a moral standpoint, that we should be aiming for a world where people are regarded as free and equal. And the political right, to the extent that it poses a barrier to that, is something that we need to understand, something that we need to respect, but ultimately something that we need to overcome.
Exactly. Okay. So last thing before I let you go for tonight, we should also plug the forthcoming book.
Long-awaited
forthcoming book. I should say that just how long it's been awaited is to a great extent my fault. I agreed. So, this book, for anybody listening to this in podcast form later, is How to Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism, a tribute to Michael Brooks. You can see Andy's artwork there if you were watching on YouTube. And this is one of the main reasons that it's quite so long awaited, is that when you first you know, I don't know, got the contract for the book maybe, or, you know, maybe it had a draft, you know, you asked if I wanted to write an introduction about it to it. And I said yes. And then like it took me several months to even like sort of sit down and try to force myself to do that. And then I really hated what I had written and like deleted it. And it took me like a bunch of months after that to go back and do it again and actually finish something I could send you. I think, you know, I was able to, I mean, even though I was able to write about Michael, no problem in like the weeks after he passed, I mean, I think like, you know, getting to be a year, 2 years, you know, afterwards, you know, by the time I actually wrote this, it was a lot harder to do it at that point. You know, I think sometimes that's how it works. You know, I don't know, maybe it just becomes more real over time, but in any case, so yeah, I, you know, my apologies for holding it up so long, but it is finally coming out in, what was it, like a couple months?
Yeah, I'm really excited. It's coming out in October. And I will say, your introduction is the best part of the book, followed by Andy's art, followed by my contribution. So really, you know, it was worth it to wait for everything, because really, you know, the stuff that I wrote is not what you're there for. You're there for the art and for your introduction. But yeah, I'm really excited about it, not just because it pays tribute to Michael, who was an astounding leftist that we lost way too early. You know, third anniversary coming up soon. Or no, third anniversary just passed. And it, you know, I really did my best to try to pay tribute to his vision, which wasn't really fully worked out when he passed away. By drawing a lot on the kind of thinkers and insights that he cherished, people like Cornel West, people like Amartya Sen. Obviously, I'm not Michael Brooks, and I could never do what Michael Brooks did. Let's be clear about that. I can only do the best I could in his stead. But I sincerely hope that were he here and were he to read the book, that he would see it as a tribute to his legacy and a tribute to his ideas. And I just hope that people read it and try to carry a little bit of that spirit forward.
Yeah. Yep. Well, you know, you're definitely, you know, I think what one of the things that Michael did brilliantly was that, you know, he was the best sort of intellectual conversationist that I've ever known, that like just in terms of sort of being able to, you know, convey in an intuitive way in conversation or on air what he meant by something, that like oftentimes like actually sitting down and trying to distill it all is really hard, and try to like say, okay, like, you know, you can kind of convey in conversation what you're getting at, but then like how do you sort of translate it? But but I was really glad that you were the person who was you know, who is doing this, and I think you'd appreciate the results. So that one is coming out in October. The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity is out now. Link to where you can get it down below, or just get it, you know, from any of the standard, you know, book places. It's a very good book. You're going to learn a lot about these thinkers. You're going to get a really sharp critique of them. It's fun to read. So do that. Read Matt's book. We are going to go to, I think, since we went very, very late with the main show, probably a short and sweet, like half an hour kind of post game. But after all the Aristotle and T.S. Eliot in the main show, we're going to do like, you know, Matt Walsh's odd obsession with diapers and in the post game. So if you are a patron, you should have long ago gotten a link to that. I will see people then. Bananas for all. Left is best.
Bananas for all. Left is best.